Loktar warriors, ask not how the Horde has served you. Ask how you can serve the Horde. King's honor, friend. Today, for this episode of the patio review of swords, we'll look at two fantasy swords and pick up to commemorate the 16th anniversary of World of Warcraft's launch. 16 years ago on this day, I was at a LAN party at my cousin's place to celebrate World of Warcraft's release. We planned a 4-day marathon during the Thanksgiving break, but the initial launch was a disaster as Blizzard's servers were overrun by millions of subscribers, logging on concurrently and shut down for a week, and the entire long weekend was lost.
What happened? I can still play.
Despite a messy launch, the game went on to be a global phenomenon and legend.
Oh, they kicked me too.
I think that some of us remember fondly World of Warcraft, especially the vanilla version and some of the earlier expansions in our either childhood or our youth. I remember that how I spent countless sleepless nights in college. I'm sure you have too. If you're watching this video, spending months, years alone or with buddies in real life and virtual, shall I say. We do all these raids and PvP. It was some emotional memory. Over the years, I came back to World of Warcraft from time to time to check out the new expansions. But since 2010, I haven't really subscribed. I followed their development. Fantasy as a genre in the early 2000s really enjoyed a degree of success, expanding its existing limited audience space, and became mainstream from the fringe genre it was in the 70s and 80s. I'm pretty positive that the release of titles such as Lord of the Rings and World of Warcraft had contributed to the popularization of the genre. Warcraft as the franchise isn't really 16 years old. It's actually close to probably 26 or 28-year-old now, since the launch of the first Warcraft strategy game. It's interesting that Blizzard was turned down, or they lost a bit in the development of the Warhammer license. But they developed their own intellectual property for the better. Game Workshop, the owner of Warhammer license, realized how big of a mistake they have made. So now they are very aggressive licensing out Warhammer universe for video games and tabletops. Speaking of the World of Warcraft, the aesthetics follows closely the Warhammer art style. It's very over the top, overly dramatic, everything is overbuilt. Now, fantasy sword designs are typically considered a big turnoff for sword collectors, occasionally even considered a taboo. I think it's an interesting intellectual exercise to look at some of the fantasy sword designs in real life and analyze how practical and functional they can be. Obviously, this makes more sense for designs more grounded to our reality, such as franchises like Lord of the Rings, Game of Thrones. Their designs are closer to the medieval European arms and armor's evolution. World of Warcraft is one example that sports this unique comical art style that grossly exaggerates everything, from characters' anatomy to their proportions of arms and armor. Their implementations don't always have to make sense physically. For example, two characters may wield the same weapon. Based on the proportions of their anatomy, the size of the weapon may scale up and down accordingly. I recognize that evaluating fantasy weapons functionality in real life can be a contentious subject. So I encourage you, the viewers, to keep an open mind when approach this topic. So I want to look at some of the fantasy weapon designs realized in real life. As you can probably imagine, there aren't too many. I pick up this sword from Windlass, obviously a fantasy design, borrowed heavily from the aesthetics of World of Warcraft or Warhammer, but they didn't get the license. So they named this the Excalibur because, well, King Arthur or the authors of the Arthurian legends are not going to climb out of the grave and sue you in court. So they have some Pendragon scene built into the sword, but it's obvious that it has a heavy World of Warcraft influence. Everything looks very chunky, overbuilt, out of proportion. Yet this one is made somewhat functional. It has a functional blade, and the hip components are vaguely inspired by medieval swords. And it also has this color palette that's very reminiscent to the Alliance scene. As the Horde counterpart, I pick up this blade. Because usually axes are the symbol of Horde. However, I feel their designs are just not functional at all. More of a scaled up version of the Stone Age tools. That's more club than axis. Now it's interesting that in World of Warcraft, all the two-handed axes are scaled up version of their one-handed counterparts. The proportion of the bow or the handle much smaller than their real-life counterparts, such as this actual historical two-handed axe, a Dane axe or a great axe, used by both Scandinavian cultures and Anglo-Saxon cultures in the Viking Age. So you can see that while the blade is much broader near the bit, here it has a longer edge, overall the size is still very manageable. In battle axes history are always single bit rather than double bit to keep the weight in check in order to be functional. Well, double-edged swords have edges on the same mass, but imagine a double bit axe will have another bit on this side of the pole. It will not double the weight of the axe, obviously, but it will add on another weight, which is useless as one swing. You can only use one hand or one bit, while battle axes with two heads and the spike exist in actual history. They always comes in form of pole ends. So they will have usually an axe head or a hammer head here. On the back head, you have either a spike or a hammer head. So the two heads are always different for different applications. To maintain a manageable weight, each of the two heads are smaller. So poleaxe axe head is usually much smaller than a Dane axe because this only has one head, doesn't have the rest of the mass. These pole weapons usually have a spear head, a spike, a hammer, or an axe. Sometimes it features a butt and spike too. So in World of Warcraft, you have different category of weapons, different skills, which make a lot of sense. However, they have two-handed hammers and axes as different category of weapons. Not realizing that those two-handed axes and hammers usually comes in the form of polearms. So having polearm as a separate category of weapon skill doesn't make a lot of sense. This just simply goes to show you the familiarity and understanding of functional weapons of the designers at Blizzard. This is not to say that I don't enjoy the settings in World of Warcraft and other fantasy universes, as the whole point of having fantasy design is you can do something you're not supposed to do in reality. I suppose that's one of the appeals. So I pick up this blade because it reminds me of the barber's blade you can acquire from Dire Maul, which is a new instance introduced in one of the earlier patches. I remember running it through with my cousin and his group. It was a harrowing experience for first-time raiders. And the Barber's Blade was a very popular sword for its stats in the vanilla game. Usually it's wielded by hunters because it's very agile. It has a pretty vicious bonus to your attack power. If you look at this Orcish Cleaver made by Chris Palmer, it's clearly a fantasy sword, and it's very similar to the Barber's Blade. It's clearly they are inspired by the Chinese Dada or Big Saber, or some call them the Chinese war swords. I have no idea why they would love to do so, but here you go.
The Chinese war sword.
The Chinese war sword.
Right, well, let's talk about your Chinese war sword here.
The Chinese war sword, which is just a badass weapon.
Two-handed Chinese war sword.
They never really specify what kind of Dao it is supposed to resemble, because it's the Chinese war sword, according to them. Dao in Chinese means knife, actually. Jian means sword, and Dao means knife, so it's a similar thing to the German Langsmesser. Would be kind of important to know what the sword is modeled after. I would say I would like to know that, but I guess people don't care. It's a war sword, right? That's all you need to know. It's a war sword. Aren't most swords war swords if you think about it?
The Chinese war sword, or the Dao, isn't featured prominently in any historical text or treatises. They were used sometimes in the Second Sino-Japanese War. I think they are an evolution of some of the cleavers as two knives, or maybe executioner's blade that peasants love to use. It has more of a intimidation factor than actually being advantageous in battle. Well, you can see that Chris Palmer incorporated, or whoever the designer is, incorporated this fantasy element to the historical design of ring pommel, featured heavily in some of the Chinese Dao design, Chinese sabers of various kinds. It has all these spikes sticking out with no apparent application. Well, I suppose in scuffle you can use it to pummel your opponents, or more likely this will catch on your clothing and rip it apart. Spikes everywhere. I appreciate that Chris didn't make this design overly gratuitous, and I like this serration on the back of the sword. Kind of resemble the Barber's Blade in World of Warcraft aesthetics. It features an 18-inch blade, which is more in line with the so-called Dao. It doesn't have any guard here whatsoever to prevent your hand from riding down to the blade. I'm not sure what this does. You choke your finger here. Ledges are very sharp on the wood, and you don't want to do that. And this part is very pointy. I suppose that it's designed so that if the blade of your opponent rides down here, it glides into this pocket and you can catch it. I'm not buying it. You get rid of the very minor guard, only slightly extended on some of the Chinese Dadaos. Well, the Chinese Dadaos, you gotta understand, it's not a great design for battle-ready swords. Similar to their opponents, the Imperial Japanese Army's Gunto, which means military saber at the time. It's more of a nationalist statement to go back to their glorious days of Tachi. So, where the Gunto resembles more of the ancient sabers, you Kyudo design, rather than the Shinto, the stereotypical katanas we see today. So that's more of a ceremonial sword, rather than a blade you use in battle. So are Chinese dadels. They symbolize Chinese troops' conviction to fight the Japanese invaders. I'm not sure how they did in battles. Although the primary opposition for this sword, or the Chinese dadel, warned bunkos, but instead rifles with bayonet. You can see that the bayonet mounted on the rifle is more like a spear, not very agile in close quarter combat. You want to fight bayonet mounted on rifles. Well, I suppose that what you want to do is you want to be dexterous with your footwork and get it in close range, probably do some parries to knock the bayonet offline and get it close and personal with your opponents and chop their limbs off. It's often cited as a suicide attack weapon, because obviously this weapon doesn't offer any reach advantage. There are stories that Chinese troops treat one life for a life in their Japanese invaders. So maybe take a bayonet in the gut and a thrust or a stab wouldn't kill you right away. Now you hold on to their weapon, so go to town with your saber before you drop. If you look at the blade profile, it broadens near the tip. It has this clip point. So while it offers some cleaving power, like an axe, it does reduce some weight here, and it makes it somewhat pointy. So thrusting is still possible, and even though I wouldn't do that myself, this presents a clear danger that and just right onto the blade. As a fantasy design, it's perfectly fine. I think it captured the spirit of the Horde, and the barbarous blade, dire maul, was created by a bunch of ogres, which is traditionally associated with the Horde. It's probable that they designed the sword in World of Warcraft to give it extra agility, because this sword offers a very extended grip. So if you hold it here, the balance is not very far away, probably 3 inches from your hand. And with this lever, it's I wouldn't say nimble, but it's definitely very manageable, very maneuverable. Of course, doing so, you will sacrifice reach. The difference of reach is pretty significant. As you can see here, this sword doesn't feature a very long blade, 33 inch, kind of like the shorter end for a hand and half sword. Almost has twice the reach as the cleaver. If you don't have a shield, and you wield this with 2 hands, you are at a very clear disadvantage, because your opponent can use their footwork to do this zoning on you and keep a distance, while they can reach you, any part of you, hands, forearms, or even your torso. You can't really reach them, so you have to devise a plan to get in close. You probably wish that you could have some really stunning parry work or luck. And your opponents has this extended guards here, so you have double the disadvantage with the absence of a functional guard. I suppose that for a dexterity kind of character, like the hunters, kind of like a sidearm. And well, if you're a hunter, this can be used as a hunting sword. Once you are done with your prey, you can field dress it. This definitely features a very mean point, some sharp edge here. I wish that this clip point here features a false edge, but it doesn't. It's very hefty, very durable. This sword doesn't feature a distal taper on the base to this part of the blade. Only slightly tapered for this portion. Well, this usually makes a sword dysfunctional. On this short blade is acceptable. And you see some of the historical dabaos, Chinese made, they lack distal taper as well. But they are not very sophisticated weapons anyway. They are mostly wielded like peasants who knows nothing about the art of swordplay. So yeah, indeed, they are more of a brutish weapon, very suitable for warriors of the Horde. The sword has a very rough finish, even if it gathers some rust on the surface, it doesn't really stand out. I also chopped some pumpkin with it and left some marks and scratches on the blade. I don't mind, it just adds to the aesthetics. The grip is made of oak, which is 2 slabs of oak as the scale, secured with 3 rivets. Yeah, I like it. It's very durable. I hack it into trees, pumpkins, bottles with hard shells, and there's no damage to the edges whatsoever at all. Primary level, that's not very deep. It's a very shallow level, only starting from maybe half an inch from the edge, and then it features another secondary level, even though it blends in with apple seed geometry. So with the blade this thick, the cutting performance isn't as good as you think. It's capable of dishing out some very clean cuts because of the rock blade, functional fantasy weapon. Not too bad. It's made of 1095 high carbon steel, which is extremely hard. As a short blade, it doesn't have any flexibility at all, given the thick cross section. I'm aware that it was cut out to this shape on a sheet of metal, and then just ground down on this primary bevel. So it's not exactly forged, it's more of a modern construction. So I'm mostly satisfied with its design, and you can look at its performance in cutting and make a judgment for yourself. And please do me a solid and stop commenting on how my form isn't up to HEMA standard, or leading with the foot instead of the blade, okay? The context is not Maestro Fiore tutoring Melanie's Duke's 7th son in the fine art of fencing. Instead, this is what we are talking about.
Yeah, that was pretty accurate. Your form is pretty
let's look at this hand and a half sword representing the Alliance. This sword is what we refer to as a hand and a half sword in historical armor context. It's light enough to use with one hand, though it has space for two-handed usage, and its leverage and maneuverability as an advantage of single-handed arming swords. The aesthetics of the sword is clearly inspired by World of Warcraft's fantasy design. We will look at how functional this sword has been designed and made, starting from the blade, Workshop Type 16A sword. It features a lenticular cross section and 3 fillers on each side. Just go down the blade to see that one primary filler that's long and deep, and 2 short and shallow and narrow secondary fillers. So I enjoy the trifuller blade with good profile taper. Historical swords usually feature tapering in 2 dimensions. One is in the profile, which this sword has. It started out very broad at the base and tapers gradually to tip. This characteristic is very typical for Type 16A sword that's popular in the 15th century. The distal taper isn't very common. This is very typical for swords manufactured by Windlass. With profile taper and distal taper, the weight distribution of the sword blade is made in a way that very hefty near the base, where your hand is, and light and nimble near the tip, so you can have very accurate point controls. It's very connected to your hand. Even though without a proper distal taper, that's usually made blades work for their swords. Also, the material used for the blade is highly functional, which is 1075 high carbon steel. A good compromise between hardness and the durability. It's tempered to have a flex, but not too much, so it maintains a degree of rigidity, which usually translates into good thrusting, very predictable cutting. So the blade has many traits that make a sword functional. What ruins it is the hilt design. They don't, like I said, they don't have the World of Warcraft or Warhammer license. So Windlass created sword with certain Arthurian aesthetics to avoid any dispute in intellectual property, I suppose. But it's unmistakably inspired by Warcraft, especially the World of Warcraft era aesthetics. To that end, they succeeded. However, in the process, they made the blade less functional and maneuverable. You see that in medieval designs, cross guards usually have intricate patterns for high status weapons, especially the dread swords, ceremonial sword, bearing swords. Well, this one features a crossguard that has this upward angle curve, but all these bits sticking out do nothing other than matching up to your clothing and or your flesh, or worse. Now this casting of the Pendragon design. Now there were plenty of examples of highly ornated sword fitting in late medieval times, close to the Renaissance. But they always ensure a high degree of ergonomics on the hilts to ensure that number one, handling is not thrown off, the balance is all correct, the weight distribution assists with your cutting and thrusting. Number two is that they should not come into hindrance when you handle a sword. And this is the direct contrast with the design of this sword, which I think very much fails to make this highly functional sword. The design made the fitting far too chunky to make the weight manageable. These are all hollow. So the pommel is hollow. It doesn't do much to serve as a counterweight to the blade. This part, even though it's hollow, the crossguard usually should be less weighty because you don't want too much weight in front of your hand. Even though it's at the base of the blade, it will fundamentally change how our sword would handle. If you look at the crossguard, it has all these sea wave or maybe fishtail pattern to suit the Pendragon theme. That's not an issue at all. It's just too scaled up. And even though it's hollow, there's a lot of weight into this. It just makes it handle way more different than any other functional sword in history. Now we will have a direct comparison, sort of a juxtaposition between a historical master sword of this size to this fantasy sword here. And you see that their size is, especially the proportion of the blade and the grip, is fairly comparable. They all feature this sand stopper pommel, but this one is, while it's not big in size, it does function rather well as a counterweight to this blade. So this sword as a whole is balanced really well, and it's has a very lively feeling, and you can even handle well with one hand. And it's a lot more comfortable to hold on to. Look at the guard. It has geometries in different dimensions, all those highly decorated pieces. Late medieval time or Renaissance features carving, sculpted crossguard, and a pommel. They're never shaped in this out of proportion way to interfere with your handling of the sword. So while this handles like a sword, this handles pretty much like a prop. And if you compare the grip here, you see that, well, their proportion is also very different. This one here features tapered grip, which is totally historical. Look at this one here, it's also tapered. But the degree of tapering makes a lot more sense, as this is very comfortable to hold in your hand, and the oval section has a flat portion that when you hold on to it, it will not turn in your hand when you cut with it, and you can have a pretty good feeling of edge alignment. This one over here just swells all the proportion. Look at the difference here. So when you hold on to it, your finger wouldn't, most of us wouldn't have a finger to meet the palm. So to hold on to this sword, it's rather tiring, even though the overall weight is quite manageable. It feels light in hand if you hold it this way, but when you hold on to the grip over here, just below the guard, as you should hold on to a sword, it feels rather fatiguing to your hand and forearm. So it's not a scientific design at all. Well, the riser here is philosophy is quite different. Usually risers on medieval swords are here to separate different portions of the grip, so you can get a good feel where your two hands should be. Well, risers, reminiscent to this one, existed in medieval time. Sometimes there are crosses on the grip. This one is, I think it's trying to make it ornate in a way to fit sea waves or the dragon's scale. Maybe that's okay. It does provide some attraction for your hand, so your hand will not slide up and down. But the thickness and dimension of this grip just ruined it. It's hard to get a good feel of the edge alignment, and it's not ergonomics at all to hold on to. In contrast, if you want a good example of fantasy swords design done right, with good design and good execution, you can look at this Warden of the North by Valiant Armory I just acquired. Here you see that there's an interesting combination between historical design and to make it more functional, and certain fantasy elements, especially the ones that would fit the TV show Game of Thrones aesthetics. They're designed for Ned Stark's ancestral Valyrian sword, Ice, which is a large two-handed sword. In historical context, it's more likely it's a bearing sword, kind of like a symbol of the house, rather than a functional battle-ready sword. This is pretty historical. In medieval times, there are these ceremonial swords that you only use in parade. They're usually very large, and more than that, they're too heavy to use in real battles. This one here is a scaled-down version based on Ned Stark's personal sword when he fought Sir Arthur Dane at the Tower of Joy. And that sword is in turn inspired by Ice, which makes sense. Narratively speaking, he hasn't inherited the ancestral sword of his house, but it makes sense that as the son of the head of the house, Ned Stark has commissioned a swordsmith to make a sword with a fitting very similar to Ice, which is basically the same as this one. The design of this sword is done by the legendary swordsmith Angus Trim. So you can see here, there are certain adornment on the throat of the scabbard. You can see the house sigil, the coat of arm, and the entirety of the scabbard is tanning away. It feels like frosted, almost like some icy substances on the surface. And the fitting, the guard here is based on Ice, Valyria's steel sword. So is the pommel here. They're almost identical. The grip is really well done with a riser. It's two sections for your two hands. And when you hold on to the sword, the blade is actually a historical blade type, the Oakshot type 13/8 sword, which is among the first longsword or two-handed sword in European history. They came about in late 13th and early 14th century, and it's a cutting-oriented sword. The lens shows that it's clearly for two-handed usage, and you see this blade is unmistakably type 13/8, so it's highly functional. It fits the Norseman's aesthetics. A very stout and beefy blade, very cutting oriented, fit their culture. But when you hold it in your hand, when you handle it, it feels like a real sword. It's comfortable to hold on to, There is a swell in the middle near the metal riser, and all the risers are very well defined. All the cord wrap is well done, evenly done. And you can have some adornment, of course, on the blade. You see there's the Paul Stark's sigil of dire wolf etched onto it. Also their words, winter is coming, and the Norse remembers. So this is very well done. The crossguard is a historical guard pipe with a swell on each end near the extremity. There is some steel section in the transition between the guard and the grip. It's done in a way that it doesn't make the guard overly chunky and weighty, so it doesn't throw your sword off balance. The guard is also a fantasy design, which is a combination of real-life fishtail pommel and maybe there's something like a bearing ball. And despite its hefty blade presses, the weight is 4 pounds, which should be on the heavier end of the spectrum for a two-handed sword of this size. So you can do a comparison here. When you hold on to them, there's a clear feel of which one is an actual sword. This one, believe me or not, is almost 1 pound heavier than this one, but it feels a lot lighter. The balance is right, the grip is ergonomic, and this one here, I would say the complete opposite. You can feel such a downgrade in terms of functionality. So, it's the windlass Excalibur sword, and I've chosen to represent the Alliance, totally irredeemable. Not necessarily. I would say that if I'm to advise the designer for this sword, to make it functional, you would need to make a few modifications. This pommel here, even though it has some geometry in different dimensions, and they try to take some inspiration from the historical sense stopper pipes and fishtail pipes, it's done way out of proportion. And these two bits sticking out on this axis, when you do any cut, incorporating rotation from the wrist, this is what happens. See that? The spike will just bite into you, your flesh. In fact, that's what exactly happened during the cutting. And you can say that you shouldn't overextend your wrist, but sometimes when you throw a cut out, it just that happens. Okay, so this is the reason why fishtail pommels, no matter how flamboyant they get, they always feel relatively flat here on this axis. They usually keep the sense stopper pommel's dimension in check, so it wouldn't interfere with the wielder's arms and hands. If I'm to make any suggestion for design of this sword, I'll say that scale the pommel down, make it solid, and you can still have some ornament or patterns carved into it. That's no problem at all. In fact, there are quite a few examples. The Svante Nilsson sword has recess in the pommel with little sculptures. If you fancy that, for sure, just keep the dimension of the sense stopper shape in check. You don't need such a big lump. Just take a comparison of these two pommels. They are both sense stopper pommel. Look at the difference. Now onto the crossguard. You can keep the crossguard mostly a bar. You can make it curve, no problem, and then you can have different patterns of ornaments on the extremity of the guard. Try to make it blend in. Try to make it flush. Don't catch on anything. Get rid of this plaque here and have some carving or sculpture in the center of the crossguard. That's no problem at all. while my statement regarding the crossguard's construction perhaps lacks a nuance. You can see for many Renaissance weapons, such as these massive two-handed weapons, features large and heavy crossguards, and the result is they certainly don't handle as lively as earlier longswords. You can see here the Lance Connect Casbalger here also features this very chunky S-shaped guard. So the result is it doesn't handle as well as some of the medieval arming swords. So while this is not a thing exclusive to this fantasy sword, it missed the point of chunky crossguard, especially this thick block here doesn't serve any defensive purpose. So while the chunky guard on this fantasy sword bring nothing but aesthetic values, the large crossguard and the side rings on these Renaissance Lighthanders and claymores definitely provides more protections to the wielders. And fix this grip, leave it to be tapered, but the proportion here is alright. They don't need to taper all the way up. You can have a very gentle curve until midway of the grip and remain that way, or even taper down. So the center part remain the thickest and keep the grip flat on this axis. So you get a good feel of the edge alignment. This sword in cutting isn't very confident, even though it does cut. When I put a fine edge on the sword. Finally, let's do a comparison, face off, so to speak, of the fantasy sword design representing the Alliance and the fantasy sword design representing the Horde. Two combatants are to meet face to face with these two swords. The swordsman wielding this one will have a significant advantage, just for the difference of the reach. You can even see for yourself in cutting, I have to step in a lot more with this sword, and even then, I wouldn't be able to cut the entirety of the large target. For this sword, it will be a lot easier. So, if you are to meet someone with a hand and pass sword like this, with a short blade like this, well, you're in serious trouble. The reach isn't everything, but it's a lot of difference here. Your opponent with this sword can basically just use footwork to outmaneuver you, and the vast reach difference is really hard to overcome. I would say this sword handles better than this one, which is quite surprising, given the blade heaviness, the mass near the tip. However, you have two hands on this long grip with a lot of leverage, and the grip is rather ergonomic. Another disadvantage of the barbarous blade, so to speak, is the lack of hand guard, hand protection. Usually the Chinese they'll have a short S guard, which is absent on this fantasy sword. I'm not sure what this hook would do. It's possible if you bind and this will catch up to it, or it'll just cut into your finger. So that's not a risk you would like to take. And hand protection isn't a small thing if you're not using a shield. If you pair this sword with a shield, well, that's a different story. The blade material-wise, whereas this one is 1095 high carbon steel, this one is 1075. They're both rather tried and true steel types for blade, with kind of on the affordable end. Usually floors with a longer blade, 5160 high carbon spring steel or 6150 these days. It can be a lot more durable. Another factor the fantasy war setting usually gets right is the swordsmith's ability to temper the material for the blade. You can have the best super steel, like M390, but if you are not sure how to heat treat it, well, you might as well stick to some of the older and simpler steel types. You have a good experience with. So in games features blacksmithing, swordsmithing, smiths usually progress through simpler materials like sometimes copper or bronze. So they kind of go through the entire history and then progress to more modern material, I should say, like steel, sometimes hardened steel in Skyrim. And then we'll just move on to full fantasy stuff, like Corium, Elementium, all these made-up types. That's fine. You know, the steel types in medieval times and Renaissance time are not equal to today's steels. Today's steel, crucible steels, are almost completely homogeneous. There's a very tiny amount of impurity in the steel, and they are evenly distributed, so you have a lot less hotspots. And the technology to heat treat steels have progressed a long way. So yeah, our technology today to work on steel is futuristic enough, you can say it's almost magical to people in medieval times, or those people in medieval fantasies. So if these sword blades are to collide edge on edge, this one is definitely harder. The 1095 has more carbon content, make it harder, and this sword will chip a lot more on the edges. However, this one is more durable, it's more flexible, it's less likely to crack or bend or break. As a verdict, fantasy sword designs in World of Warcraft is definitely over the top, and that's what they wanted. It's becoming more and more preposterous over the years, over different expansions. I would say the vanilla version, especially, strangely enough, some of the lower level weapons, their designs are quite tame, and they are based on actual historical source, believe it or not. So there you go. This is my review of the fantasy sword design in World of Warcraft. And I plan to make this a series to review and to appreciate and to criticize at the same time of fantasy sword designs in different video games, such as The Witcher, possibly the Lord of the Rings movie 2, and the video game Shadow of Mordor. It has some interesting fantasy sword design as well. I hope you find this review interesting. If so, definitely leave a like and subscribe to my channel for future content. And I will see you on the next sword review.